thank all of you for coming to today's event. I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Maeera Shreiber today, and there will be 15 minutes at the end for your questions, and we will be able to sift through them and ask Maeera at the end any questions that come up throughout the event today. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Maeera Shreiber to the ICJS today and to all of you. I'm thrilled because I've gotten to know Maeera over the past few years. She is a unique, creative, and incredible scholar, and she's also interested in the types of questions that we are here at the Institute. Her day job is as a associate professor of English at University of Utah, but she's currently in LA teaching at HUC, at the Hebrew Union College, rabbinical students. And she writes about a wide variety of things. And including Jewish American literature, ethnic American studies, religious studies, interreligious studies. She's been an author of single-authored numerous books, including Singing in a Strange Land, A Jewish American Poetics. She has administrative experience as a director of a religious studies program at the University of Utah. And we're here to talk about her book, Holy Envy, Writing in the Jewish Christian Borderzone. So I hope you can all see the book. There will be a link at the end of the presentation today or conversation where you can get 30% off should you be interested in purchasing it. And so I'm going to give you just a general introduction to the book, and then I have a few questions for Maeera. So as a lot of you know, those of you who have studied with us at ICJS, the last 50 years has witnessed a lot of growth in Jewish Christian conversation and dialogue, and that Jews and Christians are becoming more open, reading each other's scriptures and asking interesting and at times difficult questions of one another's traditions. There has been a criticism that has emerged that these conversations have become either stale or predictable, and that the kinds of questions that people are having that relate to a really complex emotional landscape sort of get pushed into the back. And so what this book is going to do and has done is sharpen the Jewish Christian dialogue by inviting you, the readers, to push past familiar terrain and really engage these complex emotional concerns that sometimes inform how we relate to the religious other. Sometimes in these conversations, we focus a lot on similarities and not a lot on difference. At ICJS, we focus primarily on difference, but this is a unique way of looking at difference in that she focuses on how emotions like shame, envy, desire can inform our interreligious encounters. And she's going to chart a new way of thinking about interreligious relations through poetry. And she's going to focus on modern and contemporary writers who really operate in what she calls the Jewish Christian Borderzone. And we're going to learn more about that shortly, in how they engage one's their own religious identity and others' religious differences. And I think it's going to be exciting for a variety of concerns, and it will really inspire people from different disciplines to consider how her work impacts their own. So Maeera, welcome. I'm thrilled that you're here with us. And the first question that I wanted to ask is what is holy envy, and what drew you to this particular concept?
So let me first just by saying that you and ICGS, I've been so looking forward to this, because the kinds of deep work that you and those who do the work with you is very exciting and urgent, and the kind of work that I hope that my work will be able to be advanced by. I really, all of you who are with us today, I hope you will be in conversation with me now, today, or later. And that's above all what the goal of the book is to facilitate new interreligious conversations. So some of you may already know the phrase holy envy. It's a phrase that Christer Stendahl first offered as a way of getting people who were engaged in an interreligious conflict in Sweden, where he came from, to stop and really think about what was at stake as they were engaging in what was becoming a very heated situation. And so the phrase is very evocative, and a lot of people have played around with it. Christer Stendahl wisely decided not to explain very much about what he meant, and instead leave it to us to try to fill it out. And so I was struck by the word envy, because envy is a pretty negative word. The green monster is often how it's represented. And I was wondering, well, what is possibly holy about such a toxic feeling? And what would it mean to really consider that dark place and how it gets activated for us in interfaith interactions? So that started me off, and then I began thinking about other emotions that get activated when we're in conversation or in a presence in some serious way with someone who is deeply invested in beliefs that are not only different from ours, but may even challenge our beliefs.
Yeah, and in your introduction, you point out that the Hebrew word, for example, for Israelites, Ivrim, comes from the root, and for those of you know Hebrew, it's ayin bet resh, and that these same three letters make up the word avera, transgression or sin. But I think what you wrote, which I think was a really lovely translation of the term avera, a violation of a sacred boundary. So as these emotions sort of inform our interactions, could you describe what a sacred boundary is and why people think these borders are so important to their religious identities?
Well, I think communities, tribes, nations, it's all about establishing boundaries and who's in and who's out. And that those boundaries take on a profound weight that is not merely about a spatial demarcation, but it's central to the identity, right? It's the people who are within that demarcated space are authentic members, and we use that word authentic deliberately, and those who are outside are not of the tribe. And as I explained in the early part of the book, boundaries have been a very, very important part of defining Jewish identities. When I teach at the University of Utah, a number of my students are of LDS faith, Latter-day Saints, and many of them have gone on missions, which are explicitly proselytizing objective. And one of the hardest and most successful moments of our conversations happens when they understand that not all religions view boundaries in the same way, right? Some religions see boundaries as more porous, and other religions really see them as inviolate. And that's a significant difference that is central to understanding, at least in the case of Jewish-Christian relations, the boundary, the issues of boundaries.
And what's interesting is that in this boundary making, there becomes this, I don't know if this is appropriate word, but a liminal space, a border zone, that you start to describe, this Jewish Christian border zone, which makes it into your title. So what makes a Jewish Christian border zone different than the boundaries that the people make in their religious identity, or the fences, or the things that I can be this person up until this point, but I'm not going into this zone? You talk about a zone that sort of incorporates a lot of different identities, but also a lot of different orientations to religion. And so what is this Jewish Christian border zone?
Well, one of the things the great discoveries for me in the book was that Judaism and Christianity have been in dialogue for a very, very long time. And what we're doing now is a continuation of what has been really a deep consideration of the differences between Judaism and Christianity, and an effort to think about the consequences theologically about those differences. And when I was growing up, I thought I knew nothing about Christianity. I thought it was completely irrelevant to my Judaism. And as I went into this book and really began considering, I was wonderfully shocked, we'll just say shocked, to discover that a lot of things that I believed were purely Jewish, uniquely Jewish, were in fact shaped by conversations with Christians. And the strong example I have is the Haggadah, the book that we use during the Passover. We do a Seder. We tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and that is a very porous book. There's lots of, and it's a conversation between Jews and Christian leaders as they're trying to sort out issues of identity. And those questions of identity are sparked by being in relation to others. So that book itself can be understood as a border zone text, something that happens in the space where Jews and Christians meet.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting is that you do bring that text at the conclusion of your book at an experience with LDS community members actually performing a Seder, and you were invited as a Jewish guest. And I think in the book you mentioned that they knew you were Jewish.
You know, it's interesting you say. I went merely as a participant.
Okay.
They quickly figured out I was Jewish.
Okay.
How, I have no clue. But
Maeera
they
Shreiber is
me
non-Jewish person?
No, Maeera Shreiber doesn't do it. And the fact that I knew all the songs, that was a giveaway. Because actually it was interesting. When I went, I thought I was just going to be able to sit on the side and observe. And really quickly, someone saw me and just said, "Come, sit over here and be with us," and which was great. It was the way to be there, and I was very grateful actually to be invited. But it was, as you know, if you look at the book, you'll see it. It was a really radically disorienting experience. And that idea of radical disorientation is really part of what I think happens when you enter those spaces of the border zone. I was going to a space that on one hand was mine. You know, I've been doing Seders ever since I was born, as far as I remember. And yet this particular Seder was being hosted by non-Jews. And what their interest in the Seder was very different from why I'm typically at a Seder. And I had to do a lot of inner religious sorting out and reorienting in the course of that experience.
Yeah, so this radical disorientation that you're describing, you see as a productive feeling. And you do focus a little bit on this radical disorientation in some of your analysis of poetry. And so I was wondering what is it about poetry, the interpretation of poetry, the writing of poetry that actually can lead to this productive radical disorientation that allows us to inhabit this Jewish Christian border zone? Is there something about poetry as opposed to some other um, medium or form of aesthetics that makes this a unique place to have those kinds of encounters?
I think for me that is absolutely true. It was a way in for me into that re-seeing of in my case the Christian other, someone I did not know, or a presence, a way of being in the world that I did not know. I think one of the things about poetry is, first of all, you have to pay attention, and merely the act, it doesn't give itself over on a first quick read. And that attentiveness itself is a huge lesson in the ways in which we need to be present when we're in real conversation with someone who, and being open to being different at the end of the poem than we were in the beginning of the poem. So that's a pace. The other thing I think about is poems are often the place where a self discovers itself by being in relation to an other, a divine other, a human other, but it is a place of meeting. And so poems themselves perform the kind of interaction, encounter that I think can advance interreligious conversations. I think just very specifically, one of the things that's beautiful about poetry is lines. It's made up of lines, and meanings happen by words being put together in particular ways, and meaning changes as you go through. And where the line breaks and a new line picks up, that's often exactly the kind of experience I've had when you're in these reseeing moments, right? That first you think you understand what's going on, and then something stops, and then something new happens in that place between the end of the line and the beginning of the next line. So it's very dramatic for me in the ways in which poetry performs the kind of ways in which meanings happen in an interreligious encounter.
Yeah, and you point that out in the introduction. I wanted to include this quote because you really succinctly captured an aspect about dialogue that we often take for granted, but that you write, being in relation to someone who is different,
Mhm.
truly other, means that you will have to change, and so will your understanding of religion. That it would seem to me that in the building of borders, you're almost circumscribing how much you're willing to change. That there is a danger in encountering the interreligious other, because you know that your change may take you beyond the borders that you have set up for yourself, your own community, and this idea of reading poetry as a place to encounter that and to grow with that, I think is poignant. And so, if
Thank
you
you.
wouldn't mind, I hope you don't mind, I want to lift a poem from the book, a fragment from Denise Levertov's poem "Standoff" that you cite in your book, and I want to put it in the chat. And maybe you wouldn't mind reading the poem for us and unpacking it with precisely that sensibility. You don't have to mimic the analysis that you provided in the book. All of you can go read it. It's brilliant and wonderful. But walk us through it and teach us it, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd love to. Sharing poems that I love with people is a joy in my life. Before I read it and maybe talk about it a little bit, I want to say something about the writer, Denise Levertov. It was a I care for all the poets I write about, but Denise Levertov was especially, her story is very poignant to me and powerful. Some of you may know her. She was known very much during the Vietnam War as a very powerful political poet. And sometimes people have read her as a Jewish poet, and I always thought she wasn't. I was surprised by that. And I started looking at some of her work because it seemed evocative in Christian imagery as well as Jewish imagery. And I discovered that her father, Paul Levertov, was the founder of what was known as Hebrew Christianity, which became what we now call Messianic Judaism. And he really passionately believed in Judaism and religion and Christianity as complementary religious positions and ways of being in the world, and that he was both and he was deeply literate as a Jew and was also deeply literate as a Christian. And it was a difficult but extraordinary experiment in trying to bring together two religious traditions. And it was difficult, I think, as a space for his children to grow up in. I think it struggled a lot. Denise struggled a lot. But this poem, for me, it's one of the Borderzone poems. It really is. It's called Standoff. So let me just read it, if you can see it in the chat, and then I'll point out a couple of things. Standoff. Assail God's hearing with gull screech knife blades. Cousin the saints to plead our cause, claiming grace abounding. God crucified on the resolve not to displume our unused wings, hears. Nailed palms cannot beat off the flames of insistent sound, strident or plaintive, nor reach to annul freedom, nor would God renege. Our shoulders ache, the abyss gapes at us. When shall we dare to fly? So, what I love about this poem, first of all, is its strength. It's an assault, a demand on divine presence, right? And first, first it talks about the saints, right, which is a kind of liminal between God, humanity, and divine. And then it moves into this first very explicitly Christian image of God crucified, but then interestingly brings up another image of wings. And one of the things that I talk about earlier is how Paul Levertov, her father, really understood a Jewish emanation of God known as the Shekhinah, or the often known as the feminine emanation, but it's often represented with wings, as a Jewish iteration of an incarnate God. And a lot of times we think that Judaism doesn't have that. That's not part of our tradition. But he really lifts up that image of the Shekhinah to say, yes, it is in Jewish tradition too. And what's so powerful to me is he sees it because of his work in Christianity. And for me, that's one of the things that really happens through interreligious dialogue, encounters, is that you discover something new about your own religion that you didn't know was there. And so this poem, with this desire, intense desire to be in relation to God, is drawing both on Christian images and on Jewish images. The other thing that I just want to point out here, and again, that you have to look at these lines to look at the power, the desire, and the intensity of the longing. The other thing, just the word abyss. I love that word. It's a huge concept. And it's a word that I pick up a little bit later in the book, working with Martin Buber, some of you may know, because he talks about a relation, to really, really go into a deep relationship with the divine means to be willing to walk into a place to see the abyss and to walk in. And he doesn't see it marked as a Jewish space or a Christian space. And so she brings us to this abyss, all of us, right? And asks us to think about what do we want from God, and when are we willing to take that chance on knowing?
Yeah, and so in creating like this relationship to God in a space that transcends adjectives, it makes transcends the adjectives that we attach to our religious selves. It adds a layer of complication in an interreligious encounter, in that, at least the way that I try to help people along when they experience a new religion or learning about a new religion, there's often a translation that takes place that doesn't actually allow for the religious other to speak on their own terms. What that means is that we're comparative creatures. So we're always going to compare what we know with something else. So it's always translating the worldviews, the ideas, and the structures of your own religion into that other person's religion in order for it to make sense to you. And that's an intellectual energy.
Right.
I often tell people who get confused when I share what a midrash is, or talk about Hebrew letters or Jewish mysticism, or pretty much anything Jewish. When you're learning a new religion, see it like learning a new language.
Yes.
Because what ends up happening is that you have to allow the grammatical forms that make up that religion speak for itself. Of course, it's not going to make sense to you. It's not your language. It's not your grammar. In the process of learning about that, you start to become more aware of your own grammatical idiosyncrasies. And that's the sort of analogy that I like to use, is that when Americans learn a foreign language, they learn how complicated English really is. Or, oh my God, I don't know what a direct object is in a sentence, right? Whatever those things are. So you're learning about yourself as you're allowing that other language to speak for itself. The reason why I bring that up is that in the third chapter of your book, you share how Jewish literary production has always been a multilingual enterprise. And that there are such things, at least the way that people talk about them, as Jewish languages and non-Jewish languages. And the politics of what makes a language Jewish, we can save for another conversation. But I'm curious to you, what does it mean for Jewish poets and Jewish writers whose native language is English to write about their experience as Jews in a non-Jewish language, assuming that English is more influenced by Christianity, the King James Bible, right? That the idea that that the language itself has some inherent religiosity that's amenable to Christianity. what then would it mean for Jews to write in this language? Isn't that activity already entering into the border zone?
That is so insightful. Absolutely right. I have I don't know if it's a secret, but I'm going to tell you this anyways. All Jewish poets that I know of, poets writing in English who identify as Jews, are deeply consumed with envy by the King James Bible.
Hmm.
They, it's really, it's a thing. It's a thing. Um, there is no other source of scripture that is as nourishing, as inspiring, as generative to poetry than the King James Bible. No matter how many more accurate translations we have from the Hebrew Bible. And it's a really deep wrestling that many Jewish poets have with sort of famously, some time ago, Cynthia Ozick, who's a very well-known Jewish writer, said that Jews can't write poetry, flat out, because English belongs to Christianity, and that it's only if what she calls a new Yiddish, which Yiddish is sort of a uniquely Jewish language, if Jews could craft a new Yiddish that would inflect English, could translate English, as it were, into a Jewish language. So I think that Jewish writers all the time are, in writing in English, are fueled by a wrestling with how to translate English into a Jewish tongue.
And so I'm wondering, given that that's the case, what would a Christian, presumably writing in Yiddish, how would that person enter this Jewish Christian border zone? Because it's presumably shared, right? There's an assumption of a shared, there's a Christian language that Jews are
Right.
operating in. I have met one person who is Christian who speaks Yiddish. She's not a poet, but I was still blown away by how well she knew it and how committed she was to the language.
Yes.
But if they start writing this kind of poetry, the intimacy in poetry and playing with the forms of the language that are somehow related to the religious identity, how do they then enter the border zone? Is it the same border zone? Does it have something to do with cultural hegemony in being a minority in a majority culture that determines the forms? Or is there something just linguistically? Right. And also, what about, I see a question that just came up, Israeli poets, right? They write in Hebrew. Are they then restricted by their language?
Right.
In the sense of what they have access to in terms of what's considered Jewish, not Jewish, et cetera? Yeah, thank you for that question, by the way. I was supposed to go to the end, but it was perfectly timed.
So you're asking really, really wonderful questions. Let me start with the last point, just because I can punt it. In fact, you all are in Baltimore, and there's a wonderful scholar named Netta Stahl at Hopkins who wrote a book about Jesus, our brother other. And she specifically wrote a book about Israeli poets writing about Jesus and the wrestling that happens in Hebrew with Christianity. Ori Tzvi Greenberg is maybe a very famous example of someone who writes about Christianity. One of the things I think that I'm fascinated by the person you mentioned who is not Jewish, who took upon themselves the hard work of learning Yiddish. That's really something. I think it's got to be a different kind of encounter, because it's the position, your target language, right? The language that you're starting from, or your source language has got to be different, right? The terms that, let's say, I'm just keep on looking at the image of crucifixion is going to register so differently in the associations, and knowing that you're going to have a lot of different texts in mind when you come to that word, and will be aware of nuances and maybe discover moments of flatness in the use of Yiddish. One of the things so far, I haven't looked into this enough, but there are many Yiddish writers who are interested in using, in engaging with Christianity. The more well-known examples, which are the ones that I know, tend to use it in a polemical way, I want to say, specifically trying to figure out, often fueled by anti-Semitism, and want to try to figure out how to disable anti-Semitism. So it has a really clear political agenda. It's less about a unmarked openness to Christianity, but I suspect there are writers, absolutely. And Paul Levertov who wrote knew Yiddish well, knew Hebrew well. He was translating all kinds of Christian texts, including St. Augustine. He translated it both into Hebrew and to Yiddish. And so there must have been, in that work, some incredible transformations of, he's coming as a Christian, as a Jew. I mean, both, to a language he knows well. And he's doing it because he wants his Jewish constituency to read the wisdom of St. Augustine.
So with that in mind too, I think toward the end of your book, you broach it in an interesting and popular way. You talk about Leonard Cohen and his song Hallelujah, which I think the song has resonated with people from all different backgrounds, religious. It's a song that appeals to a number of different aesthetic sensibilities, and that you talk about the religious background of Cohen and his own spiritual orientation. But what I want to focus on is a point that we've been pointing to in terms of the language, is that Daniel Kahn translated the song into Yiddish. And he translated it into Yiddish because of that very idea that the ideas and the concepts and the feelings were meant to be expressed in Yiddish. That
Correct.
Cohen's full religious soul would come out when translated into a language that Cohen was not writing, thinking in, or even engaging in his poetry. What do you think about that exercise? Because it's actually taking someone who is inhabiting a Jewish Christian border zone and putting them into a Jewish zone without their permission, with the intention of saying that it's speaking to their true religious self.
Right. To Cohen's. So, yeah, I have to say it's very interesting. It's a wonderful instance, and people should look at the video. It's a clip. It's out there, YouTube. When I first encountered it, it went viral in the Jewish community, and people loved it, really loved it. And I looked at it and said, this is really problematic, because what I saw was that Cohen, who is a capacious soul, really extraordinarily someone who traveled, lived, worked in border zones, both with Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism, and wrote this song that was I wouldn't say inclusive or universal. Both of those terms make me a little nervous, but it was filled with religious possibility, right? And what Kahn did was he said, oh no, this is really a Jewish song. And so he thought by translating it into Yiddish, he was helping to realize its true Jewish self, and that Cohen was truly, really only Jewish. And this song was really, truly only Jewish. And so I saw it as a locking down of the song, as opposed to really celebrating what was extraordinary about it, which was it's this, wild openness that so many people could meet and engage and find meaning in.
Yeah. So, and before I go to the wonderful questions that we have from our participants, I wanted to ask one final question and related
Okay.
to that. Is that as you start off with Holy Envy and you take us through the journeys of these different border zones, you end on I wouldn't say it's a cautious note, but but you're being conscious of certain, I was going to say enthusiasm I was going to say curb your enthusiasm, but you want us to curb our enthusiasm in considering the concept of holy insecurity, right? So that we have holy envy as our way in, but holy insecurity becomes sort of a map, at least the way that I was reading it. And you
Right.
feel free to tell me if I read that incorrectly. But you could, if you wouldn't mind talking about where the concept comes from, why it's helpful in inhabiting this Jewish Christian border zone, and what this idea of holy insecurity does to the interpretive moment with poetry.
So thank you for that. Yes, people have it's a powerful phrase, holy insecurity, and I cannot claim ownership at all. It comes from Martin Buber. And Martin Buber wrote a very small book when early on in his career that was a set of kind of Socratic or monologues, philosophical pieces, and it's a really it's not a great book, but it has this really beautiful idea in it, which he says in it, and this is from Daniel, he says, you must transcend ever anew into the transforming abyss, ever anew vowed to the holy insecurity. And one of the things that he's talking about is entering this space which is filled with uncertainty, right? Is that we're not really sure what we're going to find in the space where we encounter the religious other in our quest to reach God. I mean, that's Buber's brilliance, is that the relationship with God is only reached by way of relationship, and not just a relationship with God, but relationship with each other. And that relationship with each other will be filled with not knowing and risk. That's the other thing, is that he really names, is that it's unstable ground. It can be dangerous insofar as the self that you started with will not be the self that you end up with. And so that this going into at best, I think what happens in using this idea of holy insecurity is that the things that you thought you believed in, or the things that you were so sure that were true about your religion, get a little shook up. And you walk out with more questions than answers.
Yeah, thank you. we are going to move into some questions from
Great.
those in the call. Would you consider Marc Chagall's famous painting, White Crucifixion, an example of art inhabiting a Jewish Christian border zone?
That is so great. So I actually talk about that painting a little bit, and it's the Pope's favorite painting, which I just find so moving to me. I think it's an example in a certain way. One of the things that is different or about what Chagall's doing than maybe other people, other makers, poets and writers in the book that I look at, is that Chagall is really polemical in his use of Christian iconography. He's really looking for a way to talk to Christians at a terribly, terribly dangerous time in Jewish history, and trying desperately, poignantly to get them to see the fellowship that has to be imagined at this moment in Christian Jewish relations, and to see Jesus's Christian Jewish origins. So he's really, it's not quite a border zone piece, because he's coming in with, he's got a project in mind. But I think you can certainly have a conversation around that painting that opens up border zone space.
And moving from the aesthetic to the ceremonial or the religious, when are border zone crossings helpful to religious observance and general understanding? And then when is it damaging to original beliefs and practices?
So I thought, my own experience at the Seder, at the Passover Seder that I went to at Brigham Young University in Utah, has made me, and in general, my encounters in the course of writing this book and just with friendships, is realizing one needs to, if it's not your religion, make sure that you're invited, that you have been invited into this space, right? And that ideally you're invited into the space that has been crafted by either the person who's, so for example, I'm going to go to an iftar next week that for Ramadan, but it's an iftar that it is specifically hosted by an organization here in Los Angeles called New Ground, that is an alliance between Jews and Muslims. So they do Sukkot, they do a Jewish gathering of Sukkot, hosting others, and there's a reciprocity and an inviting host relationship is an important piece of entering into a religious ritual not your own. And I think also really maybe even reading a little bit before it and learning a little bit about what are the rituals, and curbing your enthusiasm if necessary. So not jumping in. For example, if when I've gone to Mass, I don't take the Eucharist, right? That's a ritual that belongs to believers, right? And I'm wary of being a religious tourist, and transgress, even in my affection or enthusiasm. So I think you come in, you realize you're going into a space and you're a guest there.
Yeah, and Abraham Joshua Heschel has a lovely phrase about sort of that practice, and that he calls spiritual plagiarism. Right? That it's already difficult enough for us to author our own religious experience. There's really very little need to take or purloin or steal, appropriate from others.
Right.
That space of holy envy, that it belongs to someone else and that it can't be yours. And yet at the same time, in that relationship, there is something dialectical that takes place, because
Dialectical, absolutely. We now at my Seder, we have drums. And the reason why we have drums was one year I invited someone who I had met in graduate school, who's a shaman. And he saw some drums and immediately started playing. So it was really, it was something that was brought from someone who was not Jewish, but he saw something that was organically possible in the space. So there's good things that can happen.
Sure. Great. So I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your morning. Maeera's in LA. For us, it's lunch. Again, the book is called Holy Envy: Writing in the Jewish Christian Borderzone. I really do encourage you to buy it and read it. It's a wonderful book. It's going to raise numerous questions. We're going to keep coming back to it. For a little bit of housekeeping, you're going to get at the end of the call onto the chat a prompt that will give you a link to a survey. It's a very short survey. We're very conscious and respectful of your time, but filling this survey will help us out in constantly trying to make these programs better, for all of us, but more importantly for you. And for those of you who are new to us, just know that ICJS is a non-sectarian and independent, that means unaffiliated with any academic or religious organization. So we are free, but we're not free. We rely on a lot of support by people like you. So if you have the time, and you want to continue having programming available for free at no cost, we do ask for your support in making our work possible. And finally, you should subscribe to our newsletter. You'll learn all about our upcoming programs and events, like our April 19th panel in honor of Earth Day, Interreligious Environmentalism: Confronting the Climate Crisis Together, and our inaugural Silber Obrecht lectures on April 25th and 26th, featuring and honoring Frank Clooney for his work in the field of interreligious studies. Thank you again, Maeera. It's always a joy to speak with you. Just so that all of you know, as a footnote, that Maeera and I talked about her book for a total of 7 hours before we had this conversation. So I'm impressed with us that we kept it within time.
We did.
But I also know that there are 7 other hours on the agenda in the future. So thank you.